Chapter 16. The Ship. In bed we concocted our plans for the morrow, but to my surprise and no small concern, Queequeg gave me to understand that he had been diligently consulting Yojo, the name of his black little god, and Yojo had told him 2 or 3 times over, and strongly insisted upon it every way, that instead of our going together among the whaling fleet in the harbor, and in concert selecting our craft, instead of this, I say, Yojo earnestly enjoined that the selection of the ship should rest wholly with me, inasmuch as Yojo proposed befriending us, and in order to do so had already pitched upon a vessel, which, if left to myself, I, Ishmael, should infallibly light upon. For all the world is thought, though it turned out by chance, and in that vessel I must immediately ship myself, for the present irrespective of Queequeg. I have forgotten to mention that, in many things, Queequeg placed great confidence in the excellence of Yojo's judgment and surprising forecast of things, and cherished Yojo with considerable esteem, as a rather good sort of god, who perhaps meant well enough upon the whole, but in all cases did not succeed in his benevolent designs. Now this plan of Queequeg's, or rather Yojo's, touching the selection of our craft, I did not like that plan at all. I had not a little relied upon Queequeg's sagacity to point out the whaler best fitted to carry us and our fortunes securely. But as my remonstrances produced no effect upon Queequeg, I was obliged to acquiesce, and accordingly prepared to set about this business with a determined rushing sort of energy and vigor that should quickly settle the trifling little affair. Next morning early, leaving Queequeg shutting up with Yojo in our little bedroom, for it seemed that it was some sort of Lent or Ramadan or day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, with Queequeg and Yojo that day. How it was I never could find out, for, though I applied myself to it several times, I could never master his liturgies and 39 articles, leaving Queequeg then fasting on his tomahawk pipe, and Yojo warming himself at his sacrificial fire of shavings. I sallied out among the shipping. After much prolonged sauntering and many random inquiries, I learned that there were 3 ships up for a 3 years' voyage: the Devil Dam, the Titbit, and the Pequod. Devil Dam I do not know the origin of. Titbit is obvious. Pequod, you will no doubt remember, was the name of a celebrated tribe of Massachusetts Indians, now extinct as the Medes. I peered and pried about the Devil Dam, from her hopped over to the Titbit, and finally, going on board the Pequod, looked around her for a moment, and then decided that this was the very ship for us. You may have seen many a quaint craft in your day, for aught I know. Square-rigged tow-luggers, mountainous Japanese junks, butterbox galliots, and what-not. But take my word for it, you never saw such a rare old craft as this same rare old Pequod. She was a ship of the old school, rather small, if anything, with an old-fashioned claw-footed look about her. Long seasoned and weather-stained in the typhoons and calms of all 4 oceans, her old hull's complexion was darkened like a French grenadier's, who has alike fought in Egypt and Siberia. Her venerable bows looked bearded, her masts cut somewhere on the coast of Japan, where her original ones were lost overboard in a gale. Her masts stood stiffly up like the spines of 3 old kings of Cologne. Her ancient decks were worn and wrinkled, like the pilgrim worshipping flagstone in Canterbury Cathedral, where Becket bled. But to all these her old antiquities were added new and marvelous features pertaining to the wild business that for more than half a century she had followed. Old Captain Peleg, many years her chief mate, before he commanded another vessel of his own, and now a retired seaman, and one of the principal owners of the Pequod. This old Peleg, during the term of his chief matemanship, had built upon her original grotesqueness, and inlaid it all over with quaintness both of material and device, unmatched by anything except it be Thorkild's Hake's curved buckler or bedstead. She was apparelled like any barbaric Ethiopian emperor, his neck with pendants of polished ivory. She was a thing of trophies, a cannibal of a craft, tricking herself forth in the chaste bones of her enemies. All around her unpaneled open bulwarks were garnished like one continuous jaw, with long sharp teeth of the sperm whale, inserted there for pins to fashion her old hempen thews and tendons to. Those thews ran not through the base blocks of landwood, but deftly traveled over sheaves of sea ivory. Scoring a turnstile wheel at her reverend helm, she sported there a tiller, and that tiller was in one mass, curiously carved from the long, narrow lower jaw of her hereditary foe. The helmsman who steered by that tiller in a tempest felt like a Tartar when he holds back his fiery steed by clutching its jaw. The noble craft, but somehow a most melancholy. All noble things are touched with that. Now, when I looked about her quarter-deck for one having authority in order to propose myself as a candidate for the voyage, at first I saw nobody, but I could not well overlook a strange sort of tent, or rather wigwam, pitched a little behind the mainmast. It seemed only a temporary erection used in port. It was of a conical shape some 10 feet high, consisting of long, huge slabs of limber black bone, taken from the middle and highest part of the jaws of a right whale. Planted with their broad ends on the deck, a circle of these slabs laced together, mutually sloped towards each other, and at the apex united in a tufted point, where loose hairy fibers waved to and fro like the top knot of some old Potawatomi Sacham's head. A triangular opening faced out towards the bows of the ship so that inside her commanded a complete view forward. Half concealed in this queer tenement, I at length found one who, by his aspect, seemed to have authority, and who, it being noon and the ship's work suspended, was now enjoying respite from the burden of command. He was seated on an old-fashioned oaken chair, wriggling all over with curious carving, and the bottom of which was formed of a stout interlacing of the same elastic stuff of which the wigwam was constructed. There was nothing so peculiar, perhaps, about the appearance of the elderly man I saw. He was brown and brawny like most old seamen, and heavily rolled up in blue pilot cloth, cut in the Quaker style. Only there was a fine and almost microscopic network of the minutest wrinkles interlacing around his eyes, which must have arisen from his continual sailings in many hard gales, and always looking to the windward. For this causes the muscles about the eye to become pursed together. Such eye wrinkles are very effectual in a scowl. "Is this the captain of the Pequod?" said I, advancing to the door of the tent. "Supposing it be the captain of the Pequod, what dost thou want of him?" he demanded. "I was thinking of shipping." "Thou wast, wast thou? I see thou art no Nantucketer. Ever been in a stove-boat?" "No, sir, I never have." "Dost thou know anything at all about whaling, I dare say, eh?" "Nothing, sir, but I have no doubt I shall soon learn. I have been on voyages in the merchant service, and I think that—" "Merchant service be damned, talk not that lingo to me. Dost see that leg? I'll take that leg away from thy stern if thou ever talk of merchant seamen to me again. Merchant service indeed. I suppose now ye feel considerable proud for having served in those merchant ships. But flukes, man, what makes thee want to go a-whaling, eh? It looks like a little suspicious, don't it? Hast thou not been a pirate, hast thou? Didst thou not rob thy last captain? Didst not think of murdering the officers when thou gettest to sea?" I protested my innocence of these things. I saw that under the mask of these half-humorous innuendos, this old seaman, as an insulted Quakerish Nantucketer, was full of his insular prejudices and rather distrustful of all aliens, unless they hailed from Cape Cod or the Vineyard. "But what takes thee a-whaling? I want to know that before I think of shipping ye." "Well, sir, I want to see what whaling is. I want to see the world." "Want to see what whaling is? Have ye clapped eye on Captain Ahab?" "Who is Captain Ahab, sir?" Aye, I thought so. Captain Ahab is the captain of this ship." "I'm mistaken, then. I thought I was speaking to the captain himself." "Thou art speaking Captain Peleg. That's who ye is speaking to, young man. It belongs to me and Captain Bildad to see the Pequod fitted out for the voyage and supplied with all her needs, including crew. We're part owners and agents, but as I was going to say, if thou wants to know what whaling is, as thou tellst ye do, I can put ye in a way of finding it out before ye bind yourself to it past backing out. Clap eye on Captain Ahab, young man, and thou wilt find that he has only one leg." "What do you mean, sir? Was the other one lost by a whale?" "Lost by a whale, young man? Come nearer to me. It was devoured, chewed up, crunched up by the monstrous parmacetti that ever chipped a boat. It I was a little alarmed by his energy, perhaps also a little touched at my hearty grief in his concluding exclamation, but said as calmly as I could, "What you say is no doubt true enough, sir, but how could I know there was any particular ferocity in that particular whale? Though indeed I might have inferred as much from the simple fact of the accident. Look ye now, young man, thy lungs are sort of soft, do you see? Do you not talk like a shark a bit? Sure, you've been to sea before now, but sure, what of it?" "Sir," said I thought I told you I'd been 4 voyages in the merchant." "Hard down out of that. Mind what I said about the merchant service. Don't aggravate me. I won't have it. But let us understand each other. I have given thee a hint about whaling is. Do you feel inclined for it?" "I do, sir." "Very good. Now art thou the man to pitch a harpoon down a live whale's throat, then jump after it? Answer quick." "I am, sir, if it should be positively indispensable to do so. Not to be got rid of, that is, which I don't take to be the fact." "Good again. Now then, thou only wants to go a whaling, to find out by experience what whaling is. But you also want to go in order to see the world. Was that not what you said?" "I thought so." "Well then, just step forward there and take a peep over the weather bow, and then back to me and tell me what you see there." For a moment I stood a little puzzled by his curious request, not knowing exactly how to take it, whether humorously or in earnest. But concentrating on all the crow's feet in one scowl, Captain Peleg started me on the errand. Going forward and glancing over the weather bow, I perceived that the ship was swinging to her anchor with the flood tide, was now obliquely pointed toward the open ocean. The prospect was unlimited, but exceedingly monotonous and forbidding. Not the slightest variety that I could see. "Well, what's the report?" said Peleg when I came back. "What do you see?" "Not much," I replied. "Nothing but water. Considerable horizon, though. There's a squall coming up, I think." "What wouldst thou think then of seeing the world? Do you want to go around Cape Horn to see any more of it, eh? Can't you see the world where you stand?" I was a little staggered, but go a whaling I must, and I would, and the Pequod was as good a ship as any. I thought the best, and all this I now repeated to Peleg. Seeing me so determined, he expressed his willingness to ship me. "And thou mayest as well sign the papers right off," he added. "Come along with ye." And so saying, he led the way below deck into the cabin. Seated on the transom was what seemed to me a most uncommon and surprising figure. It turned out to be Captain Bildad, who, along with Captain Peleg, was one of the largest owners of the vessel. The other shares, as is sometimes the case in these ports, being held by a crowd of old annuitants, widows, fatherless children, and chancery wards, each owning about the value of a timberhead, or a foot of plank, or a nail or two of the ship. People in Nantucket invest their money in whaling vessels the same way that you do yours in approved state stocks, bringing good interest. Now Bildad, like Peleg, and indeed many other Nantucketers, was a Quaker, the island having originally been settled by that sect, and to this day its inhabitants in general retain in uncommon measure the peculiarities of the Quaker, not only variously and anonymously modified by things altogether alien and heterogeneous. For some of these same Quakers are the most sanguinary of all sailors and whale hunters. They are fighting Quakers. They are Quakers with a vengeance. So that there are instances among them of men who, named with scripture names, a singular common fashion in the island, and in the childhood naturally imbibing the stately dramatic thee and thou of the Quaker idiom, still, from the audacious daring and boundless adventure of their subsequent lives, strangely blend with these unoutgrown peculiarities 1,000 bold dashes of character not unworthy of a Scandinavian sea king or a poetical pagan Roman. And when these things unite in a man of greatly superior natural force, with a globular brain and a ponderous heart, who also has, by the stillness and seclusion of many a long night watches in the remotest waters, and beneath constellations never seen here or at the north, being led to think untraditionally and independently, receiving all nature's sweet or savage impressions fresh from her own virgin voluntary and confiding breast, and thereby chiefly, by with some help from accidental advantages, to learn a bold and nervous lofty language, that man makes one a whole nation's census, a mighty pageant creature, formed for noble tragedies. nor will it at all detract from him, dramatically regarded, if either by birth or other circumstances. He have what seems a half-willful overruling morbidness at the bottom of his nature. For all men tragically great are made so through a certain morbidness. Be sure of this, O young ambition, all mortal greatness is but disease. But as we have now not to do with such a one, but with quite another, and still a man, who, if indeed peculiar, it only results again from another phase of the Quaker, modified by individual circumstances. Like Captain Peleg, Captain Bildad was a well-to-do, retired whaleman. But unlike Captain Peleg, who cared not a rush for what are called serious things, and indeed deemed those self-same serious things the veriest of all trifles, Captain Bildad had not only been originally educated according to the strictest sect of Nantucket Quakerism, but all his subsequent ocean life in the sight of many unclad, lovely island creatures round the Horn, all that had not moved this native-born Quaker one single jot, had not so much as altered one angle of his vest. Still, for all this immutableness, was there some lack of common consistency about worthy Captain Peleg. Though refusing from conscientious scruples to bear arms against land invaders, yet himself had illimitably invaded the Atlantic and the Pacific, and through a sworn foe to human bloodshed, yet had he in his straight-bodied coat spilled tons upon tons of Leviathan gore. How now, in the contemplative evening of his days, the pious Bildad reconciled these things in reminiscence, I do not know, but it did not seem to concern him much, and very probably he had long since come to the sage and sensible conclusion that a man's religion is one thing, and this practical world quite another. This world paid its dividends, rising from a little cabin boy in the short clothes of the drabbest drab to the harpooner, and a broad, shad-bellied waistcoat, from that becoming a boat-header, chief mate and captain, and finally a ship-owner. Bildad, as I hinted before, had concluded his adventurous career by wholly retiring from active life at the goodly age of 60, and dedicating his remaining days to the quiet receiving of his well-earned income. Now Bildad, I'm sorry to say, had the reputation of being an incorrigible old hunks, and in his sea-going days a bitter, hard taskmaster. They told me that in Nantucket, though it certainly seems a curious story, that when he sailed the old Cattegut whaleman, his crew, upon returning home, were mostly all carried ashore to the hospital, sore exhausted and worn out. For a pious man, especially a Quaker, he was certainly rather hard-headed, to say the least. He never used to swear, though, at his men, they said, but somehow he got an inordinate quality of cruel, unmitigated hard work from them. When Bildad was a chief mate, to have his drab-colored eye intently looking at you made you feel completely nervous, till you could clutch something, a hammer or a marlinspike, and go to work like mad at something or another, never mind what. Indolence and idleness perished before him. His own person was the exact embodiment of his utilitarian character. On his long, gaunt body he carried no spare flesh, no superfluous beard, his chin having a soft, economical nap to it, like the worn nap of a broad-brimmed hat. Such, then, was the person I saw seated on the transom when I viewed Captain Peleg down in the cabin. The space between the decks was small, and there, bolt upright, sat old Bildad, who always sat so and never leaned, and this to save his coat-tails. His broad brim was placed beside him, his legs were stiffly crossed, his drab vesture buttoned up to his chin, and spectacles on his nose. He seemed absorbed in reading from a ponderous volume. "Bildad," cried Captain Peleg. "At it again, Bildad, eh? You've been studying those scriptures now for the last 30 years, to my certain knowledge. How far ye got, Bildad?" As if long habituated to such profane talk from his old shipmate, Bildad, without noticing his present irreverence, quietly looked up, and seeing me, glanced again inquiringly towards Peleg. "He says he's our man, Bildad," said Peleg. "He wants to ship." "Dost he?" said Bildad in a hollow tone, and turning round to me. "I dust," I said unconsciously, he was so intense a Quaker. "What do ye think of him, Bildad?" said Peleg. "He'll do," said Bildad, eyeing me. and then went on spelling away at his book with a mumbling tone quite audibly. I thought him the queerest old Quaker I ever saw, especially as Peleg, his friend and old shipmate, seemed such a blusterer. But I said nothing, only looked round me sharply. Peleg now threw open a chest, and drawing forth the ship's articles, placed pen and ink before him, and seated himself at a little table. I began to think it was high time to settle with myself at what terms I would be willing to engage for the voyage. I was already aware that in the whaling business they paid no wages, but all hands, including the captain, received certain shares of the profit called lays, and that these lays were proportioned to the degree of importance pertaining to the respective duty of the ship's company. I was also aware that being a green hand at whaling, my own lay would not be very large, but considering that I was used to the sea, could steer a ship, splice a rope, and all that, made no doubt that from all I heard, I should be offered at least the 275th lay. That is, the 275th part of the clear net proceeds of the voyage, whatever that might eventually amount to. And though the 275th lay was what they call a rather long lay, yet it was better than nothing, and if we had a lucky voyage, it might pretty near pay for the clothing I would wear out on it, not to speak of my 3 years' beef and board, for which I would not have to pay one stiver. I might be thought that this was a very poor way to accumulate a princely fortune, and so it was, a very poor way indeed. But I am one of those who never take on about princely fortunes, and am quite content if I were ready to be if the world is ready to board and lodge me, and while I am putting up this grim sign of the thundercloud. Upon the whole, I thought the 275th lay would be a fair thing, but would not have been surprised had I been offered the 200th, considering that I was a broad-shouldered make. But one thing, nevertheless, that made me a little distrustful about receiving a generous share of the profits was this. Ashore, I had heard something of both Captain Peleg and his unaccountable old crony Bildad, how they, being the perpetual proprietors of the Pequod, therefore the other and more inconsiderable and scattered owners, left nearly the whole management of the ship's affair to these two. And I did not know but the stingy old Bildad might have a mighty deal to say about shipping hands, especially as I now found him on board the Pequod, quite at home there in the cabin, and reading his Bible as if by his own fireside. Now when Peleg was trying to mend a pen with his jackknife, old Bildad, to my no small surprise, considered that he was such an interested party in these proceedings. Bildad never heeded him, but went on mumbling to himself out of his book. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth where moth... Well, Captain Bildad, interrupted Peleg, what do you say? What lay shall we give this young man? Thou knowest best, was the sepulchral reply. The 777th wouldn't be too much, would it? Where moth and rust do corrupt, but lay indeed, and thought I, such a lay, the 777th. Well, old Bildad, you are determined that I, for one, shall not lay up many lays here below, where moth and rust do corrupt. It was an exceedingly long lay, that indeed, though from the magnitude of the figure it might first deceive a landsman, yet the slightest consideration will show that though 777 is a pretty large number, yet when you come to make a tenth of it, you will see, I say, that the 777th part of a farthing is a good deal less than the 777th gold doubloons, and so, I thought at the time. Why, blast your eyes, Bildad, cried Peleg, thou dost not want to swindle this young man, he must have more than that. 777th again, said Bildad, without lifting his eyes, and then went on mumbling, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I am going to put him down for 300, said Peleg. Do you hear that, Bildad? The 300th lay, I said. Bildad laid down his books, and turning solemnly toward him, said, Captain Peleg, thou hast a generous heart, but thou must consider the duty thou owest to the other owners of this ship, widows and orphans many of them, and that if we do too abundantly reward the labors of this young man, we may be taking the bread from those widows and those orphans. The 777th lay, Captain Peleg. Thou Bildad, roared Peleg, staring up and clattering about the cabin. Blast ye, Captain Bildad, if I had followed thy advice in these matters, I would afore now had a conscience to lug about that would be heavy enough to founder the largest ship that ever sailed round Cape Horn. Captain Peleg, said Bildad steadily, thy conscience may be drawing 10 inches of water or 10 fathoms, I cannot tell. But as thou art still an impenitent man, Captain Peleg, I greatly fear lest thy conscience be a leaky one, and will in the end sink thee foundering down to the fiery pit, Captain Peleg. Fiery pit, ye insult me, man, past all natural bearing ye insult me. It's an all-fired outrage to tell any human creature that he's bound to hell. Flukes and flames, Bildad, say that to me again and start my soul bolts. And I'll swallow a live goat with all his hair and horns on. Out of the cabin, ye canting, drab-colored son of a wooden gun, and straight wake with ye. As he thundered out, he made a rush at Bildad, but with marvelous oblique, sliding in celerity, Bildad for that time eluded him. Alarmed at this terrible outburst between the two principal and responsible owners of the ship, and feeling half a mind to give up all idea of sailing in the vessel so questionably owned and temporarily commanded, I stepped aside from the door to give egress to Bildad, who, I made no doubt, was on all eagerness to vanish from before the awakened wrath of Peleg. But to my astonishment he sat down again on the transom very quietly, and seemed to have not the slightest intention of withdrawing. He seemed quite used to the impenitent Peleg and his ways. As for Peleg, after letting off his rage as he had, there seemed no more left in him, and he too sat down like a lamb, though he twitched a little as if nervously agitated. Phew, he whistled at last. The squall's gone off to the leeward, I think. Bildad, thou used to be good at sharpening a lance. Mend a pen, will ye? My jackknife here needs the grindstone. That's he, thank ye, Bildad. Now then, my young man, Ishmael's thy name, didn't ye say? Well then, down ye go here, Ishmael, for the 300th lay. Captain Peleg, said I have a friend with me who wants to ship too. Shall I bring him down tomorrow? To be sure, said Peleg, fetch him along and we'll look at him. What lay does he want? Groaned Bildad, glancing up from the book in which he had again been burying himself. Oh, never thee mind ye about that, Bildad, said Peleg. Has he whaled at any? Turned to me. Killed more whales than I can count, Captain Peleg. Well, bring him along then. And after signing the papers, I went off, nothing doubting but that I had done a good morning's work, and that the Pequod was the identical ship that Yojo had provided to carry Queequeg and me around the Cape. But I had not proceeded far when I began to bethink that the captain with whom I was to sail yet remained unseen by me, though indeed in many cases a whale ship will be completely fitted out and receive all her crew on board ere the captain makes himself visible by arriving to take command. For sometimes these voyages are so prolonged and the shore intervals at home so exceedingly brief, that if the captain have a family or do any absorbing concernment of that sort, he does not trouble himself much about his ship in port, but leaves her to the owners till all is ready for sea. However, it is always as well to have a look at him before irrevocably committing yourselves into his hands. Turning back, I accosted Captain Peleg, inquiring where Captain Ahab was to be found. And what dost thou want of Captain Ahab? It's all right enough, thou art shipped. Yes, but I would like to see him. But I don't think thou wilt be able to see him at present. I don't know exactly what's the matter with him, but he keeps close inside the house, so sort of sick, yet he doesn't look so. In fact, he ain't sick, but no, he wasn't well either. Anyhow, young man, he won't always see me. I don't suppose he'll see thee. He's a queer man, Captain Ahab, so some think, but a good one. Oh, that'll like him well enough. No fear, no fear. He's a grand, ungodly, godlike man, Captain Ahab. Doesn't speak much, but when he does speak, then you may well listen. Mark ye, be forewarned, Ahab's above the common. Ahab's been in colleges as well as among the cannibals, been used to deeper wonders than the waves, fixed his fiery lance in mightier, stranger foes than whales. His lance, aye, the keenest and surest that out of our isle. Oh, he ain't Captain Bildad, no, he ain't Captain Peleg. He's Ahab, boy, and Ahab of old, thou knowest, was a crowned king. And a very vile one. When that wicked king was slain, the dogs, did they not lick his blood? Come hither to me. Hither, hither, said Peleg, with a significance in his eye that almost startled me. Look ye, lad, never say that on board the Pequod. Never say it anywhere. Captain Ahab did not name himself. 'Twas a foolish, ignorant whim of his crazy widowed mother, who died when he was only 12 months old. And yet the old squaw Tistig at Gayhead said that the name would somehow prove prophetic, and perhaps other fools like her may tell thee the same. I wish to warn thee it's a lie. I know Captain Ahab well. I've sailed with him as mate years ago. I know what he is. A good man, not a pious. A good man, like Bildad, but a swearing good man. Something like me, only there's a good deal more of him. Aye, I know he was never so jolly, and I know that on the passage home he was a little out of his mind for a spell. But it was the sharp shooting pains in his bleeding stump that brought that about, as anyone might see. I know, too, that ever since he lost his leg last voyage by that accursed whale, he's kind of been a moody, desperate moody, and savage sometimes, but that will all pass off. And once for all, let me tell thee and assure thee, young man, it's better to sail with a moody good captain than a laughing bad one. So goodbye to thee, and wrong not Captain Ahab, because he happens to have a wicked name. Besides, my boy, he has a wife, not 3 voyages wedded, a sweet, resigned girl. Think of that, and by the sweet girl that old man has a child. Hold ye then there can be an utter hopeless harm in Ahab? No, no, my lad, stricken, blasted if he be. Ahab has his humanities. As I walked away, I was full of thoughtfulness. What had been incidentally revealed to me of Captain Ahab filled me with a certain wild vagueness of painfulness concerning him. And somehow at the same time I felt the sympathy and sorrow for him, but for what I didn't know, unless it was a cruel loss of his leg. And yet I also felt a strange awe of him, that sort of awe which I cannot at all describe. Was not exactly awe. I do not know what it was, but I felt it, and it did not disincline me toward him, though I oft felt importance at what seemed like mystery in him, so imperfectly as he was known to me then. However, my thoughts were at length carried in other direction, so that for the present dark Ahab slipped my mind. This is the end of chapter 16. Wow, that was a long one. So, Captain Ahab, Captain the Pequod, has one leg, just like Long John Silver did in the previous book in Treasure Island. Except Ahab lost it to whales, while Silver lost it to violence, gun, sword, something or other. So Silver lost his in a fight. Ahab lost his in a fight with the whale. Now, the 2 captains, or the majority of Nantucketers, were described as Quakers. And Quakers are a branch of Christians. They are known for being pacifists. They are known for hard work. Back then, more so than now. It's also known as a Society of Friends. So they, as I said, they're known for being pacifists. They're known for being hard workers. So this is the type of people. They tend to be quiet. The oatmeal box. So if you've ever seen a box of Quaker oats, there's what the traditional Quaker looked like 100-something years ago. Now Quakers look like anybody. Richard Nixon was a Quaker. So
Explain President.
Oh, sorry. President Richard Nixon. Yeah, Lolly reminded me that, Nixon was just barely at the beginning of my time, so he's been dead for years now. But anyway, Richard Nixon was president, and he was a Quaker, and he was like the only Quaker president that we've had. But anyway, Quakers were known for hard work, somewhat being taciturn. It's quiet. Sort of like the Amish, though not with the historical holdbacks of, the Amish don't do technology. For the most part, don't do technology. But the Quakers embraced it. So they're more modern, but they came from the same Anabaptist tradition that the Amish did. They were just slightly different. And like the Amish, they're known for hard work, pacifism, plain speaking. So the ship, the Pequod. So It started out as a wooden ship, and it had been sailing for 50 years. Now, Captain Peleg had retired, and he bought part of the ship, but he had been retired for 60. He retired at 60. So he would have been a little boy when this ship was built. Maybe a teenager when this ship was built. And so it was built as a wooden ship. 3 masts. You get good speed with that. But the masts had been ripped off and replaced with masts from Japan. Various bits of the woodwork had been replaced by whale. So they talked about the jawbone of the whale being used for the tiller, and the tiller is used to steer the ship. So you have the tiller, which is a long handle, which goes back to the rudder, and the rudder is a flat board which sticks down into the water. And you push the tiller to the left, and then the rudder goes to the right. And when the rudder goes to the right, the ship goes to the right. So ships steer backwards. So if you're driving a car, you turn the wheel to the left, the car goes to the left. Well, when you're steering a boat, you push the tiller to the left, the boat goes to the right. Kind of like a motorcycle. So with a motorcycle, you push left and lean left and goes right. Yeah, you push left, lean right, it goes right. It goes the way you lean. But anyway, so a tiller works backwards from a normal steering wheel. And the tiller of the Pequod was made from a whalebone. And other various things were whalebones. And the pegs. So on old sailing ships, you would have these you would have the railing going around the outside so people don't fall off. But you would also have stuff attached to the railing. So the railing was something structural. So you have the mast going up, and you'd have ropes going like this to keep the mast from going too far to the left or too far to the right. And those were held down to pegs, belaying pegs, because you used it to belay. And anyway, rope comes down, wraps around the peg, wraps around the bottom of the peg, and keeps the rope taut. But in the Pequod, instead of being wooden pegs, these were made out of whale teeth. And various different parts of the structure had been replaced by cut down whalebone. And the whole thing was intricately carved. So, I mean, and it was also described as being dark and weathered. So this whole thing was like this Halloween monstrosity of bone and teeth and just viciousness. And a couple of times, Ishmael hinted at the tomb-like quality. Mentioned Ahab in the Bible. Ahab was the one of the nemesises of Elijah. And he was a king, and he was a bad king. And he was a bad king, and I may read you bits of that later and discuss it. But so Ahab was a biblical name. Ishmael is a biblical name. Bildad is a biblical name. I can't remember Bildad. I'm sorry, he was somebody minor. Totally forgot. I may look it up, put it in the comments. But Ishmael was the eldest son of Abraham with his mistress. So that kind of gives you the sense that Ishmael is not exactly legitimate. Ahab, as I said, was a villain, though Peleg insists that he's a good guy, so the name isn't appropriate, though we'll see what happens there with Ahab. So Ahab lost his leg to a whale, and he's been kind of weird ever since. And honestly, that can change. That can change when something, permanent scars and things that don't ever heal right can really change your perspective on things. And so Ahab lost his leg by going out to sea, just like Silver did. Oh, another thing. Remember how I mentioned at the end of Treasure Island how the guy used his money to buy a share of a ship? And I said that was a great idea because that was a way that he could make money without working hard, and that he would provide for himself in his retirement. And that's how you go from being just a little guy to being wealthy. Well, here they have the same sort of thing where just random people would buy a share of a ship. So, you put in your shilling, you put in your little silver piece, you put in whatever you can afford, and you get a cut of the ship, part of the ship. So Ishmael gets the 300th lay, gets a 300th lay, which means the ship goes out, comes back with $100,000. Or let's make the math easy. Well, yeah, comes back with $100,000. And let's say it took $40,000 to outfit the ship. So when it sailed off, you had to put on bread for sailors to eat. You had to repair stuff. You had to get canvas and lumber and all of the different things that the ship needs. So let's say they spent $40,000 on that, and the ship comes back with $100,000 worth of whales. So they sell the $100,000. They pay the $40,000 back that they used to stock up the ship. And some of that comes from investors, and some of that comes from other places. And so they pay the $40,000 back, which means they net $60,000. And net is what you have after expenses. So you have the $100,000, you take off 40, and that leaves 60, which is the net. And the 60 then gets split up a whole bunch of different ways. So Ahab's the captain, let's say he gets a tenth. So Ahab gets $6,000. And Ishmael gets a 300th of that. So 60,000 divided by 300, he gets $2,000. Which doesn't seem like much now. But the thing is that back then that was just like an incredible amount of money. And he said, yeah, it's enough to cover my clothes. It's enough to cover the food that I would eat for 3 years that I would be out at sea. So Ishmael's looking at this as, I go out to sea for 3 years. I can get a new set of clothes. And I can just sit around and do nothing for another 3 years. So, or he could take that money and he could invest it in being part of a ship. Or he could invest that in being part of a ship, and so become part owner. And next time he would go out, because he'd be an experienced whaleman, he would probably get something better than the 300th part, maybe the 250th. That's not bad. And this is, as I said, it's the part. And so you add up all the parts and then divide, and people get the money. But so Ishmael gets a very tiny part. And Bildad was like 777th, which is this excruciatingly tiny, 777th. It's like a really tiny, tiny sliver. But, it's just what? It's about 0.1%. It's a little bit more than 0.1%, which is just tiny. So, it was this tiny sliver, and 777 is another one of those numbers that shows up in the Bible in a couple of places. None of them are particularly important, but it shows up as one of those things. So one of the things about this book is that there's like all of these call outs to different things that you don't necessarily think of, and it's like you can read it through and then you almost need references to see where everything is. And that's part of what I'm trying to do with this discussion afterwards, is explain to you some of the references in there, some of the hidden things and to point out, hey, this is what he's getting at.